Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar presented by ESS BIZTOOLS, Evaluating Research and Development Product Package. I'm Peter Towers, the Managing Director of ESS BIZTOOLS, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon. What we're going to discuss today is the ESS BIZTOOLS product packages, which have been developed over the last 20 years to assist accounting businesses and business advisory firms to add value to your clients. I think this is a very important part of the process for you to be aware of. And we just had a technical issue there, which I'm just getting it fixed up. Sorry about that, everyone. The product packages have been developed so that accountancy firms, small, medium-sized and large, can benefit. And our theme for today is to look at our research and development product package, which we have developed primarily out of the COVID-19 situation, where I became aware that there were perhaps hundreds, if not thousands, of people around Australia tinkering with a research and development project. And we thought it was probably worthwhile getting on with it. The research and development material is in a number of segments. We have the accountant's documents, which is for an accounting firm or a business advisory firm or a bookkeeping firm if you wish to get involved in this sort of activity, can utilize. But there are a set of white label documents which you can download to a client who has signed on with you for the installation of a research and development system and the maintenance of that system. And you will be able to set that client up, because the prime responsibility for the record keeping is with your client. With that white label system, they should be able to do that. And your role will be more of a review, checking, audit overview to make sure that everything has been appropriately recorded. There's also supplementary documents included in the package. We have a range of these to assist you. There's the Business Advisory Services Training Package. That's 13 modules, which we now include with each of our product packages to assist accountants, business advisors and bookkeepers to be able to ensure that your teams have been appropriately trained to be able to introduce business advisory services concepts to your clients. We also produce a monthly newsletter, which is an information document for the targeted reader, which is primarily small and medium-sized businesses, people who could be your clients or your prospects. But we also view it as being a marketing tool for the accountant, business advisor or bookkeeper who has branded the Business Plus article and sent it to a client or a prospect. Because virtually every article finishes with a call to action. Are you interested in getting more details on how research and development system operates in Australia, how you could obtain a significant tax rebate? If so, contact the accountant in our organisation that you normally deal with. You can edit that to have a particular person's name included, if you wish, name of a person in your team. So the Business Plus newsletter is a great information tool for your clients and a marketing tool for you. And each month we prepare members alert, except for January. And this is a commentary on a range of business advisory services, what we've been doing, what we've been developing, matters which we think our subscribers should be aware of. We only send that to our subscribers to keep them informed. So that's the supplementary material that we're producing. In the system itself, you receive accountants' documents, which we're about to go into, and the white label documents. And I'll be showing you those in a minute. If you have any questions today, can you type in to chat if you're watching this live? And welcome to those of you who are. But if you're watching this at a later time, times which might suit you a bit better, and you have a question, please send me an email, peter@essbiztools.com.au, or you could telephone me if you wish, 1-800-232-088. So I now want to go to a different area and bring up, we are doing some work on our site at present. I don't think we're going to have a problem this afternoon. I hope we won't. But you should now be able to see the members homepage of ESS BizTools. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, we have quite a number of product packages, but the three main ones are gold, silver, and bronze. So that's showing there that I'm subscribed to each of them because I have a master code to get access. We have individual products. So everything I'm showing you on the screen today is part of our gold package. And then we go into group product packages, which are also part of it. And we have bundled packages. Then we have sections and papers and a couple of other things like members alert. What we're interested in today, though, is research and development. So I'm clicking onto research and development. And the research and development is set up in such a way that we have the actual material, which is in the two packages, accountants package and the white label, which we'll go to in a moment. But then those three other supplementary packages that I referred to before, the business advisory services training package is there, and the business plus only package is there, and the members alert. So it's all there, all contained. And if you were a subscriber, you could gain access. We're now going to go to the download content. And we have a choice here now of the accountant's documents or the owner. So we're going to click on accountant's documents. And we have the accountant's documents coming up. I made a comment before, there is work going on in the site, and that's why we're getting these delete and owner badges coming up. They normally don't appear. Hopefully it's not going to interrupt us in this presentation. What you've got in your screen now is the list of the material that's contained within research and development. We have a number of forms, and we call them BAS, Business Advisory Services. Things like planning a research and development project, the project plan, which we think is important. Admittedly, it's not required under the legislation for companies with turnovers under $20 million. But the legislation talks about the systematic progression of work. And I think the preparation of a plan and a research and development plan for each individual item, together with a budget and a return on investment calculation for what is expected to flow out of this research, because companies are not doing research for the sake of it. They're doing it so that they hope to be able to earn money out of it in the future. We've got the advanced finding and overseas finding. We're going to refer to those in a moment. Board of Directors minutes, the systematic progression of work document, recording a progression of work, employee time sheets, the work diary, research and development, contractor costs, other direct costs, schedule of contractors, advice to Board of Directors, dominant purpose of the supporting research and development activities is very important when it comes to considering whether the supporting R&D activity was there for the sole purpose of supporting a core research and development activities. The feedstock adjustment, which is basically where an item is still in the research and development phase, but some of the products that are being produced out of that research and development phase are being sold. There is a clawback in operation. There is also a clawback of any government grants or payments that have been received by the company. That material is in the process of being uploaded. It's one of the reasons the site's going through some work at present, but that will be installed in our site early next week, or finalised in its installation. Payments to associates is an important area in the research and development concept. So we have material on that. And then we move into the flowcharts, whereby we have prepared 12 flowcharts, which we think explain the process a lot easier. So there's all the flowcharts there, the FC, and then the numbers. And then we have papers. We've written papers on every aspect of research and development, and we will be adding to that during the next 12 months and into the future. Each time the government or the tax office or Oz Industry make changes in any aspect of research and development. So our intention is to keep this up to date, of course, and we will be holding regular training programs with our subscribers. Oh, and I forgot to mention the last item, last but not least, is the workbooks, because there are workbooks that have been prepared utilizing Excel to document the times for the internal labor that have worked on the project, the costs of external consultants and contractors that are working on research and development activities, the monthly progression of those costs, so that at the end of the financial year, all of the information is summarized for you to review as the accountants or business advisors, and to make sure the supporting evidence is there, and to extract from the other records that the client will be keeping on the actual results of the experiments that they are conducting. So if we go back, and I'll just move back through here to the beginning, where we'll bring up the procedure control form. Within ESS BIZTOOLS, we have a procedure control form for each product package. So the procedure control form assists in the initial planning of a project, because you've got an idea when we think you should be doing things. Enables the team to have an understanding, and it starts introducing some of these forms to you. So it's really a planning for training purpose, this initial review. And we show you the templates that we've produced, and each of these can be linked onto to gain access to them. It just takes a bit of time and slows down on a webinar. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to bring up some of the papers and BAS forms for you shortly when we go through the flowcharts. There's some marketing and promotional material that's been incorporated within the system, and we will be finalizing more of that in the next 2 weeks. Our plan is to have all of this finished by the end of April. Incidentally, the end of April is a big date, and I'm going to talk to you more about that later on, but just remember the 30th of April is the registration date with Oz Industry for last year's research and development. if your client wishes to claim the research and development rebate. We do have a quotation and proposal form within the system. We have one of those for each of the product packages, and there's now 24 of them within ESS BIZTOOLS. And then we start going into the project planning. Is your client a company? Well, they've got to be a company to be able to claim this. Is their turnover under $20 million, or is it over $20 million? And there are different rates of the calculation that can be made. The client needs to have spent more than $20,000 on legitimate research and development. So hopefully from this brief review of the procedure control form, you can gain an understanding of what we're suggesting. This is the control form that you would continually to go back to make sure that various aspects of this process have been undertaken. There's the registration with Oz Industry, which is required within 10 months of the end of the financial year. That's why the 30th of April is a key date. But if you wish to lodge, and many of your clients will wish to lodge their tax returns very early in the next financial year, so straight after the 30th of June, you need to lodge the return with Oz Industry beforehand, because they need to check what the R&D process has been, and more importantly, they need to issue a reference number, which the accountant wearing your tax agent's hat can include in the tax return, because that gives a signal to the tax office that Oz Industry have given a preliminary tick to the research and development projects. And if your client is trading at a loss and wishes to receive the research and development incentive rebate, which is 43.5% of the eligible R&D expenditure, if their turnover's under $20 million, they can receive that as a cash payment, so long as that calculated amount is less than the tax losses for the company. So if the losses are sitting at $130,000, the research and development expenditure was $100,000, there's a rebate of $43,500. If you've ticked the box that the client wants to receive the refund, the tax office will pay that money direct to the company's bank account within about 30 to 40 days after the tax return has been lodged, unless there is areas which they've raised immediate questions about. But the system is set up on the basis that that refund should flow about 30 days after the tax return is lodged, because the government appreciates that many of these companies undertaking research and development are cash strapped. They're looking for money all the time. They need this cash flow and they want to get it put back into the system. Wasn't always the way, but for about the last 14 or 15 years, we've had this benefit of companies being able to claim the rebate if they are trading at a loss. So what we might do is move back and we'll go back. I don't know, that risk management paper come up from a previous webinar I was doing an hour or so ago. So that wasn't meant to come up then. What I now want to move through to is the flowcharts. And this will give you an appreciation of the work, and we can then link to some of these forms and some of these papers so that you can clearly see what is happening. Oh, I'm very sorry. You can't see the papers. Okay, hopefully I can fix that up now. Thank you. You should be able to see the flowcharts, planning a research and development project on your screen now, I hope. Thank you for telling me it's all fixed. My apology. I have a few issues sometimes with Zoom, and my spotter is off sick today. She normally watches this on another screen. So thank you for bringing it to my attention. I'll just check there's no other messages. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so on the screen now you have a chart, and what we're looking at here is what happens within a business. I think someone gets an idea, and it might be a team member, it might be the leadership team, it might be a very junior member of the team, gets an idea and talks to the boss about it and says, and he says or she says, let's set up a project, maybe put a small team together, 1 or 2 people, and they do some preliminary investigations. Along the way, they need to check the eligibility of whether the company is going to be eligible for research and development. And basically, they need to be a company. So that if they're not a company, they're going to find they're not eligible. And they then need to decide if this is going to be a worthwhile project, they should go ahead and register a company. So to give you a feel for what's happening here, if we should be able to see there now the planning of research and development tax incentive. I'll just share this again. So the planning of research and development tax incentive is just an overview of the document. And then we can bring up the actual paper. You should be able to see the paper now, planning a research and development project. So this is the paper that backs up what I just showed you on the flowchart. The reason we produced the flowcharts is we got some feedback from some of our subscribers that whilst we should have the written material, they thought it was going to be a lot easier for people if we produce flowcharts. And they've also been included in the white label version so that you're able to sit down and show your clients how this is all working. But in the white label version, they also receive these papers so that they are able to have a full appreciation of how this research and development system works. Now, obviously you can't read that, but I'm just hopefully giving you an idea of what's included. And we're starting to now move into the hypothesis. I'm just going to leave that area at this stage and return to the flowcharts. Now, there's a couple of forms mentioned there. I'm going to bring that up. And we're just going to do a new share. So you should now be able to see this document, which is planning a research and development project, which enables the documentation to commence. Because one of the key factors in this whole research and development exercise is that none of these forms are laid down by the tax office or Oz Industry, but they require the client, the company, to have maintained a systematic progression of information. So we've gone through and drafted documentation, which we think fulfills the overall spirit of what the tax office and Oz Industry are looking for, but it also gives a proper system for a small business, medium-sized enterprise to be following if they wish to be involved in research and development. And hopefully this systematic approach will assist you as accountants or business advisors to be able to ensure that your clients are filling in the required forms so that the system can be supported. So you can do your review, you can complete your tax return and lodge it, and that the client has documented the whole process. So what is the idea? What's the objectives of the project? They should give it a project number. It's one of our strong points in the documentation. Just checking we haven't got any other issues. Thank you. Who was on the original small team? This is very important from a question of intellectual property. Who owns it? And we had a conversation as part of our regular weekly webinar conversations on business advisory services, which has been on research and development for the last 8 weeks. I had a conversation last week with Matthew Karakalakis, a very experienced commercial lawyer from Melbourne and Adelaide. And we discussed this issue of intellectual property. Your client should not be assuming that just because someone works for them and has already signed an assignment of intellectual property or a confidentiality agreement, it does not necessarily mean that that will apply to research and development work being undertaken today. The employment agreement might say that that person is a accounts clerk, but for some reason they've got involved in the R&D project team. And if these things are not looked at and tidied up, there could be a legal issue later on. So it's always a good idea to get your client to jot down who was on that small team, and then to make sure that there's a check made of the employment agreement to see that those little things, which could become a big problem, have been looked at. What was the result of the preliminary investigations? Now, the preliminary investigations have to be looked at on a worldwide basis. The law is not just saying you have to make checks and searches in Australia. It's the world. That's difficult. And we will make some comments about that in a moment. Who's the project leader? The government's assuming there's a leader in every aspect of research and development, and therefore you should be identifying who it is. What prior art or prior literature searches have been conducted? Now, this is important because the Australian government is not going to supply funding to Australian companies to undertake research and development activities unless there has been a reasonable search to make sure someone else hasn't already done this. Your clients cannot identify anything that hasn't been published or is not on the internet. It's still being held in a confidential basis in Sweden or Russia or somewhere else in the world. But if it's been published and it's well publicized on the internet, the client is expected to identify that and realize that they're not going to receive a research and development rebate for expenditure on that particular item, because the tax office will do their own checks. It's very important that you encourage your client to keep records of the checks when they've made them, to print the material that they receive from Google or whoever, any sites they've searched. Because the debate with the ATO as to whether at a particular date searches had revealed anything will not be held possibly for another 3 to 4 years. So that information needs to be kept in the files. You should be looking at it and playing devil's advocate with your client and making sure they realize the consequences, because this whole system is on the self-assessment basis. And they need to understand that if they don't perform these functions properly, there could be penalties. So what was the outcome of the prior art? And out of all this, they need to identify the hypothesis, because the hypothesis is basically that they are going to prove or disprove a statement from the conduct of a series of experiments, which they need to document. And they need to describe what new knowledge they're trying to create from this experiment. Why are they doing research and development? They're trying to create new knowledge, so they need to document that. And this is preferably done right at the beginning of the project. So you need to be trying to communicate with clients and find out if they're proposing to undertake research and development, so you get this system set up with them right from the beginning. Otherwise, you'll be backtracking and something might not be done correctly. And one of the key comments that have to be answered, or key questions that have to be answered, is you have to explain, or the client has to explain, the outcome, how the outcome of the core knowledge, I'll repeat that, how the outcome of the core activities in this project could not have been known or determined in advance on the basis of current knowledge, information, or experience. So the key communication you need to be giving to your clients is that the government is not going to hand over tax rebates, which amount to a lot of money, around $6.4 billion, unless there's been some proper searching undertaken to try to determine clearly that there's no prior art or literature, and that the new knowledge can be clearly articulated, that the company's been able to identify the hypothesis that they need to then conduct experiments on to determine whether they've got a worthwhile project and product. The company can apply for an overseas finding. In fact, they should apply for the overseas finding by the 30th of June of the year that they spend the money overseas. But my recommendation is that they should lodge an overseas finding before they spend $1 overseas, because the tax office and Oz Industries have got some barriers around agreeing to fund overseas expenditure. They'd prefer it was done in Australia. There are some areas that you can claim to have the work done overseas if it's not possible to conduct that research in Australia. But on a best case basis, I think you should be trying to get that determination made by lodging the application prior to spending any money. Your client can also get an advance finding, which is they submit full details of what they're proposing to do to the tax office and Oz Industry before spending any money. And then they sit back and wait, which could be some time, for a ruling to come back. And that ruling comes back from Oz Industry, which will say, yes, we've approved or we've disapproved. If they've approved, it's normally for the expenditure to be undertaken in the next 2 to 3 years. You would normally specify that in the application to them. And you will then need to stress to your client that they then have to undertake the project the way they have outlined in that submission. And we've got a list there of the project team. They can also talk to collaborative organizations. These can be consultants, contractors, and other people. And it's a good idea if they've had some discussions with those experts as to whether they know of anyone else that's already undertaken this type of research. So that's that form, and hopefully that gives you some idea of the type of forms that we're including in this system. So what would happen then? We would move into the project coordinator. We've got the form there for the prior art searches, as I mentioned before, documentation of that, list of the core activities that are proposed to be undertaken. What we have on the screen now is the planning a systematic progression of work, which I referred to before. So it's further documentation on the prior art searches. If you've been able to find anything, you can identify the author and the identified material, because your client may have to differentiate what they're going to do from what the prior art or literature searches that they've found. They need to then to identify at least one core activity. This is what they're going to be doing. They need to answer that they undertook this for the generation of new knowledge. And what was that? And then we've got provision here for them to record what their hypotheses were. Now, obviously, if you want to amend any of this to get some additional information from your clients, you can. We've got here add details of any other hypothesis. We've provided for 3 there. In some cases, it might be more than 3. Just add schedules to it so that the information's been recorded. We've got here a section to record who the competent professionals are that have been approached. What's their qualifications? Did they give an opinion in writing? Or did they express it verbally? What did they say? And this is primarily at this stage relating to the prior art, the prior literature. Do they know anything? So we've made provision there for 3 or 4 of these people. And we've also made provision for any other experts that they've talked to and the material they've identified from other sources. And they need to answer, could this outcome have been known in advance of the hypothesis experiments? And basically, they need to be signing off if they wish to claim the research and development rebate that, in their opinion, it could not have been known in advance of testing the hypothesis that have been summarized in item 4. And then they need to have the evidence of their purpose, or the actual results. And have they retained all of the records? Again, I stress that this has all been based on self-assessment. They've spent this money in a financial year, say ended June 20. There's no approval at this stage unless they got an advanced finding from anyone in Oz Industry or the ATO. They don't know about a new project. Probably don't know about a company if it hasn't been claiming R&D previously. And then they've got 10 months in which to submit the information. So they need to be keeping the records that, and preferably a set of records for each R&D projects. Some of them will be doing far more than one project. I've been working on a rather large claim in which there's 23 projects underway, and they are all separately documented. All of this information is available for them on an individual basis. So this flow chart is just catching up with a couple of those things we just referred to. So all this process that we've been looking at in this flow chart is really to get it all ready to submit a report to the board of directors for them to approve the process. So I'm looking for So we're going to now look at the research and development plan. I mentioned before this is not required by the tax office. Although a former chairman of the Industry Research Board did write an article about 8 or 9 years ago, which suggested that the project plan should be prepared. They are required for companies with turnovers over $20 million. I think it's a good part of this whole process to have a plan, because it clearly identifies to any government reviewer that this had been thought through, had been prepared, and had been submitted to the board of directors for approval. So this is a document that, out of everything that's happened so far, but we haven't done any work. All we're doing is assembling the information to submit a report to the board of directors, irrespective of whether the board of directors has only got 1 director or 6 directors, doesn't matter. It's the process that it's going to the board, and it's clearly identified what's going to be done, including the labour costing and the cost estimates. Once it's gone to the board of directors will approve it, and we have a sample of a minute of a board of directors meeting in the system that they've approved of this particular project. And we're now ready to move on. So we can go on now to the next flowchart. Which is what we call getting ready. There's 10 key issues in this one. And there are papers, and that's what they're referred to here. So I'm not going to bring them up because time's moving on, and but they're there. So the appointment of the team, we've got a note about employment agreements and confidentiality agreements. We talked about that earlier. And our suggestion, if the business is big enough, it should have someone called the R&D manager, who might be different to the person leading this team. The names of the people involved should be going to him or her, and they should be running a check, and we've got that later on, to make sure that their employment agreements are satisfactory. They cover the sort of issues that I referred to earlier. Contractors are obviously different to employees. The company needs to determine what their relationship's going to be, so they need to have a work contract, and they need to clearly identify whether the contractor's got any share of the ownership of the intellectual property being developed. If they're being paid, I can't see why they'd have any share of the ownership. But as you know, it's important that the intellectual property agreements are clarified. Otherwise, the contractor or professional could be claiming they own part of the final product. And confidentiality agreements also need to be completed. And we have in the system a schedule of contractors so that if Oz Industry or tax office is asking questions about contractors in 3 or 4 years' time, the information is readily available. The same system applies for what the guidelines call competent professionals. It's obviously universities and researchers. The employment agreement or the engagement agreement is very important. And the assignment of intellectual property, or if there's sharing of intellectual property, which does happen, of course, with universities, that needs to be documented. And in our legal overview webinar last week, Matthew Karakalakis was very strong on that, that these things should be reviewed now at this time when this decision's been made. So we have records for the then we go through and summarize the eligible expenditure. It basically falls into a few categories: labor that needs to be substantiated by timesheets or some other time recording system, labor on cost, which is applicable to the business, decline in value of assets that have been involved in the research and development process, and other charges that are involved in a project code. And we'll come to supporting activities shortly. So the project codes should have a number. We're recommending that you talk to your clients about establishing task codes. On that rather large project that I'm working with as a consultant, there are 23 or 24 projects. There's over 100 task codes that the company's developed. So instead of someone writing what in some cases could be 20 words to describe what they've done, they've put that into a system and given them a 3 or 4 digit code number, which is a lot easier for everyone to remember. The codes are placed around the work environment, so it's very clear for people to find the task that they just undertook and to record that task code. Why? The legislation requires documentation of what's been done. So by doing this, we've got a very good record, and it's the employee that's signing off on this. It's their timesheet. So it helps the company if there is a dispute with the tax office, that it's not just the managing director or the R&D manager saying that 3,000 hours of team time was spent on a particular project. It's been documented by the team. They've completed their timesheets daily into weekly, and then from there on, if our system's been utilized, it's been picked up and summarized through the workbooks so that the total hours of labor for individual people has been determined, and then their labor cost is able to be transferred in out of the labor system as to what they cost for that particular month, and the calculations can then be prepared. I don't think some of the systems that have been utilized in the past, where people have taken a guess at a percentage and charged 70% of this person and 80 or 90, in some cases 100% of another person to R&D, will hold water with the authorities in the future. I think we need to make sure that proper time records are being submitted, and task records. What did they do? So we've designed our system that will facilitate that information. We've also talked about time units. This is whether you're going to record in minutes and hours, or you allocate time units. It's similar to what accountants have been doing, or a lot of accountants have been doing for a long time: 6-minute units, 10-minute units, 12-minute units. In our material, we suggest a 10-minute or a 15-minute unit. You could have smaller units, of course, 5 minutes, depends on the client. I just think it's a bit easier to record the unit numbers rather than various minutes and hours and different combinations. But that's up to you and your client to determine. In the material, you've got forms which cover both contingencies. Labour on cost, obviously the biggest labour on cost is, or one of the biggest is superannuation, but holiday pay, etc., can also be factored in together with workers' comp and payroll tax if that's been paid by your client. So at the end of it, we're going to get a cost summary of what the labour cost has been. So that at the end of each month, the system that we've produced is being used. Management will be receiving a consolidated research and development cost. And our recommendation is a report should be going back to the board of directors. That report should obviously be documented and kept in the files. And the minute of the board of directors meeting where it's noted the research and development activities, I think is a very good defense mechanism on this overall interpretation of the systematic progression of activities, that it's been reported back to the board's noted it and authorised the expenditure to continue on the basis that a legitimate project is being undertaken. The next one I want to refer to is the planning the work project. So this is basically the board's now given approval, the company's ready to go. Perhaps there's a new person in charge of it. I think they should, again, probably proportionate to the amount of money that's going to be spent on a project, but it's real money no matter how much it is, really, isn't it? A very small business spending $40,000 on this, that's a lot of money for them. They need to just make sure, do one final check that a separate person in the team has looked to see if they agree with the prior art searches. They're not going to look very smart if in 2 or 3 years' time they get challenged and the Oz Industry or the Tax Office is able to produce a dozen different references that were on the internet at around this time. They need to have their evidence there, produced in a file, dated, so that if something gets announced in 6 weeks' time, well, it's the date of that all this was done at that's the important one from this company's point of view. They need to be really thinking seriously now about work that cannot be performed in Australia. And as I said earlier, our recommendation is they'd be immediately lodging the overseas finding application before they spend any money. They could look at the option of lodging an advanced finding for the total project, which obviously includes the Australian expenditure. We have some material which is not part of the legislative requirements on protection of intellectual property, because I had a lot to do with developing or assisting people who were developing new technology. I was a business advisor for Oz Industries' COMET program, commercializing emerging technology. And we came across people who had developed things and hadn't really gone down the process of trying to protect with patents. They'd already published it. They'd already talked about it. They'd given TV and radio interviews. And when they went and saw a patent attorney, they were told it was too late. So we've included that material in here to alert you as the key advisor to your client to have a discussion with them about this, as to whether they need to apply for a patent or want to apply for a patent, and whether they're going to apply for trademarks and registered designs, etc. So that's what that form's about. And I'm just going to move on. I've talked a fair bit in our presentation on the systematic progression of work. This is just the form that's summarizing that. The experiments need to be recorded and documented, and there's forms there to assist you in doing that, or your client doing that. They should be recording the results of every experiment, both the ones that are successful and the ones that are not successful. They can still claim the expenditure if the experiments were not successful. And we've got in the system the concept of team meetings being held on a regular basis. It's one of the things that Oz industry reviewers are looking for, that this has been an ongoing basis, that there has been proper research strategies introduced to it, that there's ongoing reviewing of where we're at, what's happening. And we've included some governance statements for the person in charge to sign at the end of the year to say, this is the work that was undertaken. And then a report could go back to the board of directors. This is the summary of the material being generated for labour. There's a few references there. Some of them are duplicated because we've got either a time unit system or an hour and minute type system. We have set up Excel spreadsheets which will enable that to be collated for the workforce. And there's also supporting labour summaries, supporting activities to support the core activity and need to have their own numbers and separate records maintained. So that's all been summarised within the system. This is the summary of contractors' costs, which is just basically a summary of their invoices so that they're in a proper file for when a check needs to be made. Competent professionals are basically the same. The material needs to be recorded and supporting evidence retained, and obviously details of where the professional worked. And then we've got the other direct costs. So these are costs that relate to a core activity that are able to be directly allocated. So the system is basically the same for those three key cost areas. We then have supporting research and development expenditure. A supporting research and development activity must be linked to a core activity, and we have a form whereby you would give that, your client would complete that form, which identifies that the supporting activity was being done primarily for the core activity. We've got some notes in the papers that are there, that 5052, 060, looking at some of these expenditure items that are grey areas when it comes to supporting R&D. And we've tried to put the arguments and the comments into those papers so you can look at it. The key thing is supporting R&D must be required for a core R&D activity to be conducted. And the key word is dominant purpose. It's the dominant purpose of what is being undertaken in the supporting R&D activity for a core R&D activity. For argument's sake, I'm involved in a dairy project, and there's a lot of research been undertaken on milk production, quality, timing, all sorts of things. So the various components of the milk evaluation are core R&D projects, because there is hypothesis for each of those. But unless you milk the cows, you cannot have the product they need to conduct the core project. So we're claiming that the supporting R&D activity for the cows that are subjected to the milk evaluation is the actual milking of the cows. So if that gives you some help in understanding, there needs to be a nexus between this whole concept of dominant purpose, the supporting R&D, and a core R&D activity. So there's a fair bit of material there, as you can see. It's summarized in the papers. And we've got some real comments on this dominant purpose activity. I know this looks a lot of information, and R&D is complicated. It's probably the reason a lot of smaller accountancy firms have not got involved with it over the years. But there are over 13,000 companies. A significant number of them are small and medium-sized companies. So they're involved in it. And I suspect out of what's happened in the last 12 months or so, there's going to be a lot more people starting to put their hands up as they start thinking about the commercial potential out of some of the things they've been involved in. Feedstock is another unique area for research and development. Basically, it is any process that's going on as a core R&D project, and some of those goods that are being produced are being sold. The tax office wants some of their money back. It's as simple as that. So they're saying you're still undertaking in research and development and receiving the 43.5% on that expenditure. That's why we've summarized there all the activities have been undertaken. And if it's for core research and development, it's potentially going to be part of a feedstock adjustment. If it's not, there's no need to worry. So there's a few tests there to be answered, and we summarize how the feedstock revenue is determined, because basically you have to pay a feedstock adjustment a feedstock adjustment comes into the calculation of the research and development rebate based on the lesser of the income or the expenditure relating to that activity. So here's the formula I was going through to find it. We get the two amounts of that activity that relates to something that's still in research and development phase. What's the amount of expenditure that relates to it? What's the amount of income? You take the lower figure, income or expenditure, and then take 33 1/3% of that figure. And that's the amount that appears as an income item in the calculation of the research and development rebate. So obviously it's an offset against what you would have otherwise got. And then we have a calculation there. So we're saying the material costs included in research that have been sold was 165. The feedstock revenue was 193. The smallest amount was the costs, the 165. 33 1/3 of that is that. And the adjustment to be shown in the company's income tax return is 54,000 times 26%. the company rate. So it ends up being an overall adjustment of $14,285. I mightn't have said that clearly before. I just said multiply by the 33 1/3. I didn't take it to the next phase. That's the amount that appears, and then it's further adjusted by this calculation on the company tax rate. So that is in fact the adjustment amount, which is reflected in the company's tax return. There is an adjustment for loans, grants from the government, which we're still finalising that segment, which will be uploaded, as I said at the beginning, next week. And here's a chart for determining what all the costs are that are going to be flowing into this project. And I know there's lines going everywhere. We have developed the flowcharts, the workbooks for these flowcharts, which summarises that information for you. Then we have the tax incentive checklist. So all this work's been undertaken primarily so that you as the accountant can then get to work to determine what's going to be disclosed in the company's tax return. So you need all this information we've been talking about on the costs and so that's for the core projects and then the supporting costs. But you also need to review the P&L account to extract certain information, and we've got links there to the various forms. Payments to associates is a key area in research and development. You can only claim payments to an associate if they've actually been paid, even if the company's operating on the accrual system. You can still only claim the payment to an associate if that payment has physically been paid, and you have to supply information to support that. And the information then has to be submitted. So I'll just what you got there is the research and development project codes. This is what you would be, in effect, this is part of the documentation required to be extracted from the company's records as to what projects that have been undertaken during the year. And that various cost information is the other component of that information to be submitted. And the form which actually has to go in first, which is to Oz Industry, and that's the form that's due on the 30th of April or prior to lodging the company's tax return. So this is the type of information: number of employees, employees engaged in R&D, the title, the objectives, the new knowledge. And then for each individual project, the project code, the title, you list the hypothesis, even if there's 10 of them, you list them, list details of the experiments conducted, what was the process, what was the observation, what was the conclusion. Now that might end up being 2 or 3 pages, A4 pages per project code. You need to supply detailed information as to what has occurred. So that's the overview. I'm just going to finish off now. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found this overview interesting. And I want to remind you that the Oz Industry registration has to be made by the 30th of April. There is a 3 months extension that is available, but you have to submit a fair bit of information. If you want to know more, please contact us for a one-on-one conversation. You can go to our website, www.essbiztools.com.au, to register for that. Or you can telephone me on 1-800-232-088. Thank you for being with us. Have a great day. Bye.